The wilderness can hide horrors that defy explanation, testing even the most experienced outdoorsmen. From two hunters lost in the foggy Appalachian backcountry, surrounded by impossible footprints and silent watchers, to a lone fisherman on a remote Quebec lake whose campsite was rearranged by something massive and unseen. Get ready to witness 6 stories that reveal encounters that leave the mind racing and the forest feeling alive with menace. In October 2024, 2 lifelong friends, Ethan Walker and Cole Jennings, ventured deep into the Appalachian backcountry on a hunt they had dreamed about since childhood. Both had grown up in the shadow of those endless ridges, their youth spent learning the trails, studying tracks, and testing themselves against the rugged wilderness. Now in their 30s, they were seasoned hunters who had faced bears, coyotes, and storms without fear. But what drew them back this time was something different. A legend whispered in nearby towns about a monstrous black bear that left prints the size of dinner plates and gutted deer without feeding on them. It sounded impossible, but the curiosity that had guided them all their lives was stronger than reason. For 3 days they hiked across ridges blanketed in dying leaves, the air sharp with the smell of pine and decay. They found claw marks gouged deep into birch bark far higher than any bear could reach, and along the riverbank they discovered a set of tracks that froze them in place, massive, perfectly defined, yet oddly human in shape, each step sinking inches into the soft mud. Ethan studied them longer than Cole, uneasy with their symmetry, while Cole grinned and said it had to be the bear. But the deeper they went, the quieter the forest grew, until even the constant trill of insects vanished, replaced by the faint rush of wind threading through the trees. By the 4th evening, fog crept between the trunks in low, twisting layers that blurred distance and made every shadow seem alive. The men set camp near a narrow creek, building a fire and cleaning their rifles. But Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something had been following them since dusk. Once, he thought he saw movement on the slope beyond, the faint outline of a figure standing perfectly still among the birches, tall and broad-shouldered, its surface blending with the dim light as if wrapped in shadow. When he blinked, it was gone. He told himself it was just the mist, yet he couldn't stop glancing back toward the ridge where he'd seen it. As darkness settled, a heavy silence spread across the valley. The fire snapped, their breath hung in clouds, and the forest felt impossibly close. Then came a sound that didn't belong there. One single deep knock, like wood striking wood, echoing from the distance. Cole lifted his head, eyes narrowing, but said nothing. A second knock followed, closer this time. Then another, farther away, as if answering. Ethan's stomach tightened. Bears didn't make sounds like that. When they crawled into their tent, sleep never came. The forest stayed awake around them, restless and watching. Near midnight, they heard slow, deliberate footsteps circling the campsite. The ground seemed to tremble faintly under each step, heavy but measured, never rushing, never stumbling. Ethan's hand gripped his flashlight, his breath shallow as the sound stopped just outside the tent, so close he could hear the weight of it shifting in the leaves. He turned the light on and swept the beam across the fog, but nothing was there, only the trees standing silent and unmoved. The air smelled strange, thick and musky, and for a moment he thought he could hear faint breathing from beyond the glow. Then the footsteps started again, fading toward the creek until they vanished into the night. When dawn finally came, the fire was cold, the fog lingering low over the ground. Cole stepped outside first and stopped short. Their gear had been moved. Backpacks were lined neatly beside the tent, the rifles stacked upright in a perfect triangle. And along the edge of the trail, small stones had been balanced on one another in a long, curving pattern that led into the trees. Ethan's heart hammered as he realized that none of it made sense. Whatever had moved their gear had done so with precision, not curiosity or rage. It had been organized, deliberate, almost careful. They packed quickly, neither speaking, each listening for the faintest sign of movement. A few hundred yards from camp, Ethan looked down and froze again. In the soft earth beside the trail was a footprint, long, wide, and deeply pressed. the toes splayed like a human's, but easily twice the size. The edges were crisp, fresh, and pointed directly toward where they had slept. He stared at it for a long moment before Cole urged him forward, his face pale beneath the morning light. The fog thickened as they moved downhill, and several times Ethan thought he heard faint cracks of branches in the distance, following their descent, always staying just out of view. When they reached the base of the valley, the forest grew darker, the canopy closing overhead until only thin blades of light filtered through. They passed another series of prints leading away from the creek, each step farther apart than a man could manage, as though something massive had crossed in only a few strides. Ethan's unease turned to dread when he noticed that the birds were silent again, as if the forest itself refused to make a sound. By late afternoon, they reached the old logging road that marked the edge of the wilderness. The moment they stepped onto it, the air seemed lighter, the tension breaking like a rope that had been cut. Still, neither looked back, the truck bumping over gravel, the forest shrinking in the rearview mirror but never leaving their thoughts. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. The images replayed in his mind. The figure in the fog, the knocks, the ordered stones. He realized that whatever had followed them had known exactly where they were and what they were doing, and that its curiosity had been focused, not instinctive. It hadn't wanted to attack them. It had wanted to study them, to see how they would react. The thought chilled him more than any predator ever had. In the weeks that followed, locals claimed to hear strange knocking sounds echoing through the valleys at dusk, sometimes followed by distant howls that carried for miles before fading into silence. When hunters went missing later that season, authorities blamed bears and warned of increased activity after a dry summer. But Ethan knew what he had heard that night, the intelligence behind those sounds, the quiet rearrangement of their world while they slept. In late September 2019, a thick fog rolled over the forests of northern Quebec, curling low across the black water of a small, isolated lake known only to locals as Lac des Ombres. It was a place few visited and fewer spoke of, hidden among vast stretches of spruce and fir, its glassy surface often reflecting nothing but the pale sky above. That morning, a fisherman named Mark Duval pushed his small aluminum boat into the mist, his retriever Bram leaping in beside him. Mark had lived his whole life near those forests. A quiet man who loved the solitude of wild places, he found that fishing alone was his way of feeling part of the landscape. He had left early before sunrise, with plans to stay until dusk, but as the fog thickened, it swallowed both man and dog until they vanished completely from view. When he failed to return the next day, his friends assumed he had camped along the shore, as he sometimes did. By the third day, however, local rangers were called. They found his truck parked neatly at the forest edge, a trail of footprints leading to the water, but none returning. Hours later, a search team spotted his boat drifting near the center of the lake, its reflection dull beneath the gray sky. Inside, Mark sat slumped forward over the oars, his body cold and still, one hand locked in a death grip around the wood. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no damage to his clothing. His face was calm, yet his eyes were open, fixed on the horizon as though still watching something move through the mist. Bram was gone. The rescuers pulled the boat to shore, but what they found unsettled them far more than the man's lifeless body. Along the gunnels, deep gouges had been carved into the metal, each several inches long, parallel, and curved slightly, as though made by enormous hands with thick nails or claws that had raked downward in deliberate motion. His fishing gear, normally scattered across the boat, had been neatly stacked into small, symmetrical piles, hooks and sinkers arranged in perfect lines, his tackle box balanced atop his cooler, lures hung in a pattern along the rope handle. It was too precise to be random, yet too strange to make sense. On the muddy bank, investigators found enormous barefoot prints circling the landing area. They were wide, heavy, and distinctly human-like, but far too large to belong to any man. Each print was pressed deep into the earth, the impressions clean and recent, with a stride too long for even the tallest person. They trailed along the edge of the water, looping once around the spot where the boat had been tied before vanishing into the dense wall of trees. In the same area, branches had been broken and woven into strange, deliberate patterns, rough arches and stacked stones pointing inland, as if marking a path towards something hidden within the forest. The air around the lake was still and unnervingly quiet. Not a single bird called. No frogs croaked. Even the wind seemed to hesitate, as though the wilderness itself was holding its breath. Rangers recorded the scene, photographed the prints, and brought Mark's body to the coroner, but nothing in the report explained what had happened. There were no injuries, no water in his lungs, no sign of poisoning. It was as if he had simply stopped living while still in motion. Search teams combed the forest for Bram for days, following faint tracks through the mud until they disappeared near a dry creek bed. Every night, as they returned to camp, they spoke in low voices about the strange shapes they had seen in the fog, shadows that moved without sound, trees that seemed to sway when the air was perfectly still. Some refused to stay past sundown, claiming to hear heavy footsteps beyond the lantern light, echoing through the woods in slow, deliberate rhythm, always distant but never gone. Weeks later, a hunter found Bram's body deep within the forest, nearly 6 miles from the lake. The dog lay atop a pile of broken branches, his fur clean, his body unmarked, as though he had been gently placed there. The limbs beneath him were arranged in a spiral, twisting inward, and a large stone had been set at the center beside him. The hunter left without touching anything. When investigators returned, they found the same eerie silence pressing in around them, the same absence of birds and insects, the same suffocating stillness that felt like being watched. They took the remains, photographed the scene, and left as quickly as they could. No one ever returned to that exact spot again. In the final report, Mark's death was listed as undetermined, possibly cardiac failure brought on by cold exposure. The tracks were attributed to distorted impressions in soft soil. The gouges on the boat were dismissed as damage from rocks or debris. Yet none of the men who had been there that day accepted those explanations. They spoke quietly of something massive moving in the fog, something that walked upright and knew how to touch without breaking, how to arrange without chaos. By winter, locals began to avoid the local lake altogether. They said the place had changed, that even the animals avoided its bank, that lights flickered beneath the fog at night, and strange knocking sounds echoed from across the water. Mark's boat remains locked in storage now, the gouges still visible, the metal warped and scarred. No one fishes that lake anymore, and few will speak of what happened. The only thing certain is that something beyond explanation moved through that fog, something ancient, deliberate, and far too intelligent to be mistaken for any animal. And somewhere beyond the tree line, where the prints once vanished, the forest still stands untouched, waiting, as if guarding the secret of what truly rose from the mist that morning. In the foothills of Alberta, where rolling forest meets the first shadow of the Rockies, a small RV park sat tucked between pines and mist, the kind of place travelers found by accident and rarely revisited. In early June 2025, a man named Daniel Kerr arrived there just before midnight, the headlights of his truck cutting through fog that hung thick across the gravel road. He was a quiet man, 45 years old, divorced, with a routine that often took him from one remote campsite to another, photographing landscapes and keeping to himself. The park manager remembered his polite tone, the fatigue in his eyes, and how he had chosen a space at the far end near the forest edge, away from the few other guests who had settled in for the night. By morning, Daniel was gone. His camper stood open, lights off, coffee pot still half full, and the faint scent of breakfast grease lingering in the cool air. His truck was parked where he had left it, keys resting on the table inside, bed neatly made, phone and wallet untouched. Nothing was missing, nothing broken. It was as though he had stepped outside for a moment and simply vanished into the dark. A neighboring camper reported hearing strange noises during the night. Around 2 a.m., they had been woken by a steady rhythm, a deep, resonant knock against metal, slow and deliberate, echoing across the still campground. Between each knock came the unmistakable sound of footsteps, heavy, measured, circling Daniel's RV in wide, cautious arcs. The neighbor had peered through their blinds, but the night was so black and the fog so dense that even the faint glow from the porch lights was swallowed whole. They saw nothing, though the sounds continued for several minutes before fading into silence. When morning came, they noticed Daniel's camper door ajar, and the unease that followed never left them. Authorities arrived by noon. They found no sign of forced entry, no evidence of violence, no footprints or tire tracks leading away. The ground around the RV was undisturbed, the dew unbroken. Officers expanded the search outward, combing the surrounding woods and riverbanks with dogs and drones, but found nothing. No clothing, no trail, not even a single human print. The forest behind the park was dense and sprawling, a labyrinth of cedar and fir stretching for miles toward the foothills, where logging roads twisted like veins through untouched wilderness. Rangers described the atmosphere as unusually quiet, even for that region. Birds were absent, and the usual hum of insects seemed dampened beneath a strange stillness that made every footstep sound louder than it should have. Searchers spoke of feeling watched, of catching brief flickers of movement at the edge of vision, shadows that shifted between trunks, too large to be deer, yet too silent to be anything familiar. The official investigation lasted 11 days. Theories ranged from a planned disappearance to animal attack to misadventure in the woods, but none fit the evidence. There was no sign that Daniel had left willingly. His campsite was orderly, his belongings undisturbed, and his last phone signal had come from inside the RV just after midnight. There was no evidence of animals nearby, no claw marks, no disturbance in the underbrush, no trace of struggle. The case was left open, unsolved, one of many that the park would quietly collect over the years. Those who had camped nearby began to leave early after that, uneasy with the way the forest seemed to press closer after sunset. Some claimed to hear faint knocks echoing from deep within the trees, rhythmic and distant, sometimes answered by a second series further away, as though something large was communicating across the dark. A few described hearing footsteps in the gravel when no one was around, or waking to find small rocks arranged neatly outside their doors. Each story was brushed aside as imagination, yet no one stayed more than one night once the fog began to rise. Weeks after Daniel's disappearance, a team of hikers passing through the area reported finding strange tree formations along a ridge several miles north of the RV park. Two massive trunks twisted together at their bases, surrounded by balanced stones and broken branches arranged in a deliberate circular pattern. The hikers took photos, later examined by local officials, but nothing was found of Daniel, and no evidence linked the scene to his case. Still, the formations seemed too intentional to ignore, and those who saw them in person described a heavy quiet that felt alive, like the woods themselves were aware of their presence. As summer faded, the park's population dwindled. Word spread through nearby towns that something strange lingered in those woods, something unseen yet ever-present. Locals began to call it the Silent Zone, a place where sound itself seemed swallowed. Truckers passing along the highway claimed to see movement in the fog, tall shapes shifting at the tree line, then vanishing as soon as lights touched them. Others spoke of deep, resonant knocks echoing through the valley in the early morning hours, always 3 at a time, always followed by silence. By autumn, the park closed for the season. The owner told reporters that it was due to financial strain, but those who knew him said he refused to stay there alone anymore. He had once been skeptical of the stories until one night he heard the same pattern of knocks himself, slow, deliberate, and impossibly loud, followed by the faint sound of something heavy brushing against the side of his own camper. He had opened his door to find nothing, not even disturbed gravel, yet the echo of that sound stayed with him long after he left the park for good. No trace of Daniel Kerr was ever found. His family had the camper towed away, leaving behind only the empty lot at the forest's edge, where the grass grew higher each year and the air stayed unnaturally still. Visitors who pass through the area now say the woods feel wrong at night, that even the wind seems to pause before entering. Some swear they've heard faint knocking from far beyond the road, a low, patient rhythm that carries through the fog before fading into the dark. In the far north of British Columbia, where endless forest met mountains veiled in mist, a narrow river wound through spruce and alder, its banks littered with the bones of fallen trees and the quiet prints of passing wildlife. It was along that forgotten stretch, in the late autumn of 2021, that Simon Reed set up camp. He was a trapper by trade, a solitary man who had spent years working those backwoods alone, mapping the movements of beavers, foxes, and martens for his living. The cold never bothered him, nor did the silence that settled each night, for the wilderness had always felt like home to him. But that night, something about the stillness of the forest felt wrong, as though the very air was waiting for something unseen to move. He had reached the river at dusk after a long day checking his trap lines, and the fatigue had dulled his instincts. The sky was a dull gray, the sun long hidden behind low clouds, and the wind carried the faint scent of rain and pine resin. Simon pitched his small canvas tent beside the water, stacked his firewood neatly, and cooked a small meal before crawling into his sleeping bag. The rhythmic sound of the current lulled him to sleep, but sometime past 2 in the morning, he woke to a sound that didn't belong, the low, guttural growl of something massive vibrating through the earth beneath him. At first, he thought it was a bear. He reached instinctively for the knife beside his cot, but before he could move, a heavy thud shook the ground outside. Another followed, slow and deliberate, circling the tent in measured steps that stopped, then started again, each one sinking deep into the soil. The growl came once more, longer this time, as if whatever was out there was testing him, waiting for him to move. Simon held his breath, his pulse pounding in his ears, his hand frozen inches from the knife handle. The next sound was a low scrape, like coarse skin dragging against the fabric, followed by pressure against the side of the tent. The canvas bowed inward as though something enormous was leaning on it, its weight immense and steady. Simon could see the outline of a shape through the dim glow of his dying fire. Broad shoulders, a long arm pressing down, the faint ripple of a movement that felt almost human in its precision. Then the entire tent seemed to shift, the poles creaking, the floor sinking beneath an invisible weight. He tried to move, to reach for his knife, but his body refused to respond. Fear had locked him still. He could feel vibrations in the ground, the slow rhythm of breathing or movement so deep it seemed to come from beneath the earth itself. The air inside the tent grew thick, heavy with the smell of wet soil and musk, a wild odor that stung his nose and clung to his skin. For what felt like hours, he lay frozen, listening to the sound of footsteps circling again and again, the occasional low thump of something touching the fabric, brushing past, returning, always moving in perfect, deliberate loops. Once the tent wall near his head pressed inward sharply, the fabric stretching as though a massive hand had pushed against it. He heard a faint exhale, a sound like breath, deeper, rougher, almost curious. Then came silence, complete suffocating silence that lasted until the first pale streak of dawn filtered through the trees. When the sounds finally stopped, Simon waited, counting his breaths, afraid to move in case it returned. When he finally stepped outside, the camp was untouched yet transformed. The soft ground was littered with enormous tracks, barefoot impressions at least twice the size of his own boots, each perfectly defined, looping around the tent in wide arcs before vanishing into the trees. The spacing between them suggested a stride impossibly long for any man. His supplies had been moved, not scattered or rifled through, but arranged in an unsettling order. His pack propped upright beside the fire pit, his cooking gear stacked neatly on a flat stone, his traps placed side by side in a straight line along the riverbank. Nearby, small piles of broken branches had been carefully arranged, the pieces balanced and angled as though placed there with purpose. He stared at them for a long time, unable to understand the pattern but certain that it had meaning. Nothing about the scene resembled the chaos of an animal encounter. It felt deliberate, intelligent, and disturbingly precise, as though something had examined his belongings and then rebuilt the space to its own design. The forest around him was utterly still. Not a single bird called. The air felt heavy, muffled, like the moments before a storm. Even the river seemed to move more quietly than before, its ripples dulled, as though sound itself was being swallowed. Simon packed his things quickly, his hands shaking, every instinct screaming for him to leave. He didn't eat, didn't check his traps, didn't look back. He moved fast along the game trail, his boots crunching through frost and dead leaves, feeling eyes on him the entire way until the trees thinned and he reached his truck hours later. He told no one for days, unsure of what he had experienced or what words could possibly describe it. When he finally spoke, he described it as a presence, something vast and aware, something that moved like a man, but carried the weight of the earth in its steps. He never camped alone again after that. Weeks later, locals passing through the same stretch reported finding strange arrangements near the river. Stones balanced on logs, branches woven together in the shape of spirals, footprints pressed deep into the soil that vanished halfway across the clearing. Today, few people camp near that river. The forest there is quiet, too quiet, and those who pass through say the air feels wrong, as if it remembers. At dawn on October 6, 2015, a long-haul trucker named Aaron McKenzie was found collapsed beside his rig on a remote stretch of highway cutting through the northern wilderness of British Columbia, a region known for its deep valleys, silent forests, and miles of empty road that wound between endless spruce and mist. The air was sharp with the cold of early morning, and the first rays of sunlight cut through a light fog that clung to the asphalt. When another trucker, driving the same route, spotted the semi pulled off onto the shoulder with its hazard lights flashing weakly, he assumed Aaron had stopped to rest. But when he approached, what he found was something far more disturbing, something that made the man's stomach tighten and his breath catch in the cold air. Aaron was lying against the side of his truck, barely conscious, his hands trembling, his face pale and drenched in sweat despite the chill. His breathing was shallow and erratic, and his eyes seemed unable to focus, darting toward the dense wall of trees lining the highway as if something still lingered there. The side of the rig told another story. Deep parallel gouges tore across the metal doors, long and precise, cutting through paint and steel with a force that seemed deliberate. They weren't the kind of marks left by an accident or a collision with debris. They were clean, smooth, and patterned, as though something had dragged enormous claws down the surface in slow, measured strokes. The truck's mirrors were bent backward, and one of the side steps had been torn completely off, lying twisted in the gravel. Yet the cab itself was locked from the inside, and nothing appeared stolen. The engine was still warm. When the paramedics arrived, Aaron was barely responsive. He kept muttering broken phrases, his lips cracked and pale, fragments of sentences that made little sense. He said something had been watching him, something enormous that had come out of the dark and stopped beside his rig while he rested in the driver's seat. His words were uneven, the kind of disjointed rambling of a man too terrified to describe what he had seen. He spoke of a shadow moving against the glare of his headlights, a shape that towered higher than the cab, its eyes reflecting faint light as it stepped forward through the rain. He said the ground had trembled when it moved, and that the truck had rocked as if something had pressed against it. Investigators searched the scene after he was taken away, and what they found left them uneasy. Around the truck, the soft earth bore deep impressions, barefoot prints measuring nearly twice the length of a man's boot, each one pressed so firmly that the edges were defined even in the damp gravel. The prints formed a loose circle around the rig, uneven but purposeful, as if whatever had made them had paced around the truck before retreating into the forest. The trail ended abruptly at the tree line, where the ground turned to moss and needles, leaving no further sign of passage. The investigators noted the strange precision of the damage on the vehicle, and the absence of any fur, blood, or trace evidence to suggest an animal attack. That stretch of road was known among drivers as one of the loneliest routes in the province, a place where radio signals faded, cell service dropped, and fog settled so thick it seemed to swallow the world. The surrounding forest was vast, layered with ancient spruce and cedar, and locals often spoke of the silence there, a silence so complete that even the hum of insects seemed to vanish after sunset. In the days that followed, truckers who passed through the area began reporting strange feelings of being watched, as though something was following their rigs just beyond the range of their mirrors. Some said they caught glimpses of movement through the fog, something upright, massive, and dark, vanishing the instant they turned their lights toward it. Aaron remained hospitalized for several days. Physically, he was uninjured except for minor bruising along his chest and arms, consistent with having fallen or been struck lightly. But he refused to return to work, claiming he couldn't bear to drive again, especially at night. Those who visited him described him as haunted, his hands shaking whenever the topic of the highway came up. He told one visitor that he had woken during the night to the sound of scratching against the door of his cab, a slow, steady drag of metal on metal, followed by a deep, rhythmic thudding that made the truck vibrate. He had turned on his headlights and seen something massive standing in front of the grill, something that seemed to breathe in the cold air and then disappear into the fog as if it had never been there. Authorities listed the case as inconclusive. They suggested the damage might have come from an attempted break-in, though no tools, footprints, or fingerprints were found that supported that theory. Wildlife officers proposed the unlikely possibility of a bear encounter. However, the spacing and shape of the prints did not match any known species, and the symmetrical scratches on the vehicle appeared intentional rather than erratic. The incident report quietly noted possible stress-related hallucination, but even those who had been first to the scene doubted that explanation. They had seen the prints themselves, felt the weight of the atmosphere along that road, the strange, heavy stillness that hung over the trees, as if something immense had passed through only moments earlier. Within weeks, stories began spreading among truckers, each version more detailed than the last. Some claimed to have seen glowing eyes in the tree line on misty mornings. Others said they heard knocking sounds echoing from the woods while parked overnight, deep, deliberate rhythms like someone striking wood with force. A few swore that on moonless nights, massive shapes could be seen moving in the fog near the bends where Aaron's rig had stopped. Aaron never drove again. He sold his truck, moved south, and refused to speak publicly about what happened. But those who knew him said he would sometimes wake in the middle of the night, sweating and gasping, convinced that something was outside watching through the window. For years afterward, drivers along that highway slowed when the fog grew thick, scanning the edges of the forest for movement. The gouges on the roadside guardrail near mile marker 70 remained for seasons, faint reminders of that morning when a man was found alive but hollow-eyed, whispering of something vast and unseen that had waited for him in the dark. On September 11, 2020, during a grueling endurance marathon along a remote section of the Appalachian Trail, cyclist Ryan Carter joined hundreds of other riders weaving through narrow forest paths under low clouds and early morning mist. The route wound through steep valleys and old-growth timber, the air heavy with the scent of rain-soaked leaves and the rhythmic sound of tires pressing through damp earth. For the first few miles, it was just the sound of gears breathing and the faint hiss of chains. But as the fog thickened and visibility dropped, Ryan began to notice a strange unease settling in. Something subtle at first, a feeling that the forest was watching. The mist pressed low to the ground, pooling between tree trunks and curling around the edges of the trail. Riders ahead of him vanished into it, only their reflective vests glinting faintly before fading into white. Somewhere deep in the woods, a branch cracked, not sharply, but with the weight of something large moving carefully. Ryan's eyes flicked toward the sound, expecting to see a deer or a bear pushing through the brush. Instead, the undergrowth seemed to shudder and part briefly, as though something enormous had shifted behind it, keeping pace with the riders but staying just out of sight. The movement was smooth, deliberate, not the clumsy pattern of startled wildlife. He strained to listen, but all he could hear was the echo of his own breath and the steady rhythm of his pedaling. As the trail curved along a ridge, the mist thinned slightly, revealing glimpses of shadow between the trees. It was then that he saw it, just for an instant, a tall, upright silhouette gliding parallel to the trail, impossibly large and fluid in motion, its form distorted by the fog but unmistakably humanoid. It moved with intent, almost effortlessly, covering ground with silent strides that seemed to match the pace of the riders. Ryan's pulse quickened. He looked again, but the figure had vanished behind a stand of pines. A moment later, another rider passed him, unaware, focused on the incline ahead, their wheels cutting shallow grooves through the mud. Ryan tried to convince himself it was a trick of the fog, a shadow or illusion formed by the uneven light. But every few seconds, the brush stirred again, branches bending under unseen weight, faint sounds of something breathing, deep and steady, keeping to the tree line. Further along the trail, the riders spread out, each swallowed by the dense forest. The air grew colder, heavy with silence broken only by faint, rhythmic knocks that carried through the fog. The sound wasn't random. It came in slow, even intervals like measured strikes against wood. Some cyclists later said they heard it too, a hollow, echoing pattern that followed them for miles, moving ahead and then behind as though circling. Ryan felt it deep in his chest, each impact resonating through the trees, the kind of sound that didn't just reach the ears but settled into the bones. He tried to ignore it, focusing on the next climb, the next turn, the sound of the chain spinning under tension. But every time he looked toward the edge of the forest, he caught fleeting motion, something vast, upright and unnaturally silent, pacing them in perfect rhythm. At one point, the trail crossed a narrow wooden bridge spanning a small ravine, the planks slick from overnight rain. Ryan dismounted briefly, steadying himself as he pushed his bike across and glanced toward the far bank where fog drifted low through the underbrush. That was when he saw it most clearly. A massive shadowed figure stood among the trees not 20 yards away, its height impossible, its shoulders broad and still, its outline faint but solid against the shifting mist. For several seconds, neither he nor it moved. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the air dead still except for the faint creak of the bridge beneath him. Then, as another rider approached from behind, the figure turned with slow, deliberate motion and stepped backward into the fog until it was gone. When the trail leveled out again, Ryan could no longer see movement, but the sense of being followed never left. The forest grew silent in unnatural intervals, with birds falling quiet all at once. The normal background of rustling leaves was replaced by faint thuds that came from somewhere far off, measured, heavy, and purposeful. Riders later said they felt it too, that strange vibration through the ground, as if something enormous moved in sync with them just beyond sight. One cyclist described the feeling as being inside a living thing, surrounded by something aware and intelligent, yet completely hidden. By the time Ryan reached the checkpoint near mile 30, the fog had begun to lift, revealing a stretch of trail lined with soft mud. What startled him most were the impressions visible near the edge of the track, massive, human-like footprints pressed deep into the earth, each spaced far apart, the stride far too long for any man. They led parallel to the course for several meters before vanishing into the brush, where broken branches marked a clear path downward toward the ravine. When he pointed them out to one of the race volunteers, they dismissed it as erosion or damage from a passing animal, though no known animal in the region left prints remotely that size. By the end of the race, stories began to spread among participants. Some claimed to have heard strange vocalizations echoing through the trees, low, mournful tones carried on the wind. Others swore they saw a fleeting movement between the trunk, something tall and silent moving just beyond the fog. Organizers, confronted with growing rumors, attributed the reports to exhaustion, low visibility, and imagination heightened by isolation. Yet in the weeks following the event, several riders reached out privately to say they still couldn't shake what they'd felt, that constant awareness of being observed, as though something unseen had moved beside them for miles. Ryan never forgot that morning. In his mind, he could still recall the shape in the fog, the stillness, the quiet, the impossible size. He would later say that no matter how much he tried to rationalize it, he knew deep down that whatever had walked beside the cyclist that day had not been an illusion or trick of the light. It had been there, intelligent and patient, watching silently from the mist-shrouded forest as they passed through its world.